Welcome to another episode of Simply Bitcoin IRL. Today's guest is Matt Hill. He's the CEO of Start9 Labs, one of my favorite companies in the space. So many interesting things they're doing. They just released the Embassy Pro, which in my opinion is going to change everything. We're going to get to all that, but before, I want to give a very special shout out to the company that powers the show, SwanBitcoin.com. It's the best place to buy Bitcoin. Swan, the best way to build your Bitcoin stack with automated Bitcoin savings plans and instant purchases, serving clients of any size from $10 to $10 million. As a company by Bitcoiners for Bitcoiners, I highly recommend them. Go check out swanbitcoin.com today. I want to say hello to my guest, Matt. It's always a great time. I don't think we've done a Simply Bitcoin IRL before. I think we've just done the regular show, but welcome, man. And I was telegramming you because for a fact, because so to kind of give everyone the short story, right? We were on the floor of Bitcoin 2022 and I went to the Start9 booth and Matt and I knew each other from before, and I went up to him and he's like, Nico, I got to tell you about the Embassy Pro. And, I don't really buy things on the floor, but when he was convincing me, I was like, here, take, that meme, take my, I put money on the pre-sale of the Embassy Pro, and I'm really excited for it. I'm really looking forward to it because one of the things, guys, that I have issues with, for example, Raspberry Pi as my node is, unfortunately, it takes a long time to sync sometimes. So especially if you've been using that Bitcoin wallet for a long time, but the Embassy Pro is a workhorse. I think it has an i9 in it. Is that correct? Or an i7?
7.
An i7. So what is the Embassy Pro? What is your logic behind it? And who's it for?
Give me 1 second. I actually just had someone walk in real quick. So we're trying to join the Twitter Spaces so that we can be live with the company account here and
all good.
Okay. Password manager sharing issues. Yeah, don't worry about it. Okay. If it syncs, it syncs. Sorry. Question: Embassy Pro. Who's it for? Why'd we do it?
Yes. Who's it for? Why'd we do it? Why'd you do it? Better said.
Oh, okay. Because the Raspberry Pi, as more and more people are beginning to recognize, has some sort of essential shortcomings when it comes to reliability and scalability of these self-hosted software systems. The Raspberry Pi is really designed for originally children to kind of tinker with mini PCs and learn how to do coding and to host software. Early on, the Bitcoin ecosystem adopted Raspberry Pis as the go-to easiest, cheapest, yet adequately powerful way to run a Bitcoin node. And to be fair, that's true, right? Raspberry Pis are fine. In fact, the Embassy One, we continued to sell with the Raspberry Pi as our single board computer base. It just has its limitations. And those come in a variety of factors, primarily from an inadequacy of power. So for instance, if you want to plug in like a big HDD or multiple SSDs into the Raspberry Pi, it's going to fail. It just doesn't provide an enormous amount of actual power to devices that are plugged into it, and so can lead to things like data corruption if you attempt to do that. Number two is the CPU is just not super strong. So when it comes to like syncing Bitcoin, that's going to be the primary bottleneck, and you're going to get sync times anywhere from like 2 days to 2 weeks, depending on a variety of other factors like bandwidth and whether or not you're running a 4 gig Pi or an 8 gig Pi. But anyway, long story short, the Raspberry Pi just is kind of an entry-level beginner's device. And what we need for not only Bitcoin and Lightning and all of these layer 3 applications that are coming online, but also for just the whole host of other applications out there that have nothing to do with Bitcoin, but are really important to the concept of self-sovereignty, privacy, censorship resistance. They have compute and RAM and disk needs that the Raspberry Pi just wasn't going to fulfill out of the box. So we knew something more powerful was necessary. And we took the initiative to get ahead of that. I mean, way before the industry was even moving away from the Raspberry Pi, we had the Embassy Pro already in the works, already pre-selling it. And so we just we knew where the trend was going and decided to get ahead of it and put the best, biggest, baddest thing out there. The Embassy Pro is, like you said, it's an i7, 32 gigs of RAM, comes with a 2 terabyte NVMe, and it is based on Purism's Pure OS, which by as part of the bootloader disables the Intel Management Engine, which is sort of the known backdoor of Intel chips. Purism has managed to disable that in firmware, and so it's also the most secure device that you can get that is based on an Intel chip.
So yeah, and that's exactly what you told me on the floor of the Bitcoin conference, and I was really excited. And what got me excited was when you told me, it's like, because I'm an Electrum junkie, I've been using it for a while. I know people are like Sparrow, 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 but I don't, it's my taste, and you got to leave me alone. And the Raspberry Pi, it just takes so long to sync, right? Especially if you've been using that Bitcoin wallet for a long time and you just have all these addresses, it just takes at least a minute or two. And then another thing that you were telling me that was really fascinating was this concept of being, I know that you told me over Telegram that it's not going to be available to Q1, but this ability to be able to connect to your node remotely over ClearNet. And you were telling me on how you were going to do that behind a domain and all these very interesting stuff. So could you tell the audience about that? Because I think ideally that's what I've been looking for a long time, right? If I'm overseas, if I'm traveling, which I do a lot, right? And I spin up my Electrum wallet. Unfortunately, I'll connect it, either you could do through Tor, but just kind of it's kind of very slow. Or what I mostly do is, of course, I have different Bitcoin wallets. I turn on a VPN and I just use the Blockstream Electrum server, right? And that sucks, right? Because you're doxing some of those Bitcoin addresses to Blockstream. Even though I love Atom, I think it's a great company, but still, ideally, this is Bitcoin. You want to minimize that trust. So, could you talk a little bit about that functionality that you guys are looking to implement into the Embassy Pro?
Yeah, and to be clear, it will not just be the Embassy Pro. Primarily and really almost exclusively, the value add that Start9 produces is Embassy OS. The Embassy Pro is just a powerful hardware device that comes pre-installed with Embassy OS, but then you have the Embassy One. Both of these things will be fully capable of serving over ClearNet, as you described. But I'll provide a little bit more background and context here. So initially, we offered Embassy OS over Tor only. So not even on the local area network of your home. The only way to use your Embassy and any of its installed services was via Tor v3 hidden URLs, hidden services. So for instance, when you spin up your Embassy, it would spit out a brand new, never before seen Tor v3 hidden service URL that you could then visit to administer your device from anywhere, including when you were sitting right next to it. And we started that way because it was plug and play, had built-in NAT punching, was anonymous and private by default, and it just worked, okay? It worked slowly, as most people know about Tor, but it did just kind of work. What we did immediately after that was we went to the total other end of the spectrum and implemented LAN or .local support, such that if you happen to be next to your device or on the same local area network, Wi-Fi network as your device, then you could talk to it not over the internet. You would just talk to it on the local area network, which is faster than ClearNet because it's not leaving the network at all. It's just the most direct connection you can have. So the way it exists currently is that when you are home, you use .local for both your Embassy and all of its services. Each service gets its own unique .local address. Your Embassy gets its own unique .local address. And then when you're on the go, you access your Embassy and all of its services from their unique .onion URLs and access it over Tor. So this is a nice dual strategy for super fast and secure at home, super slow and secure on the go. And what we need is things in between, okay? Because the trade-offs associated with using, say, ClearNet, like a .com domain to access your Embassy and its services on the go are minimal for many people and in many use cases, right? There are some instances where it's like, absolutely not. I'm not allowing this thing that I am self-hosting to go anywhere near the DNS providers and certificate cabal that has come to dominate what we call ClearNet. ClearNet really being defined as SSL plus DNS. So when we say ClearNet, that's what we mean. We mean SSL plus DNS. And both of those things involve trusted third parties. Not that they can see everything that you're doing, not that there's necessarily a huge privacy concern, but there's definitely censorship concerns. There may be backdoors that we're unaware of. So it's just kind of this like realm of, you can and probably will do it for certain things, but it was super important for us to first build out the totally sovereign local area network and Tor points of access before building something that has any trade-offs at all with regard to privacy, censorship resistance, and general sovereignty. However, we are doing it, and it is coming. And one of the main reasons that we're doing ClearNet, properly defined, like I just said, is for businesses and content creators and organizations of any kind, because very rarely are you going to be a content creator and tell people that they can find your blog or podcast on gibberish.onion URL on it. And by the way, you have to use a Tor browser. That's just not, you're not going to get a lot of followers, right? Because it's very esoteric and kind of scary sounding, and not a lot of people are going to do it. If you're an organization, say like a church, you're not going to turn to your congregation and tell them all to download a Tor browser and use that to access the church, community forum so that they can talk and interact with other members. So ClearNet is the way here, which is that in the near future, as you said, Q1 targeting next year, you will be able to reserve a ClearNet domain, either at your own choosing or bootstrap one through Start9, like, nico.start9.me or something like that, in order to host both your embassy and its main dashboard, as well as any and every service that you choose to also strap onto that domain or subdomain thereof. So for instance, you will be able to, so let's say you're running an e-commerce store that sells stickers, and you don't want to tell people to go to gibberish.onion domain to shop. You'd rather have them go to store.simplybitcoin.com and host your self-hosted BTC Pay server store at that domain. You will be able to do that, meaning it's being served from your embassy in your home to the world at a very accessible ClearNet domain. This also does wonders for things like Lightning, where Tor nodes can become unreliable and therefore lose reputation in the rankings. ClearNet is just more reliable, it's faster, but again, it does come with this trade-off of you are now involving, we'll call it the incumbents of the existing internet. You are now involving the registrars and the DNS providers and the certificate authorities. So it's not without cost.
Absolutely. I mean, and there's trade-offs with everything, right? I'm not an engineer, but I always say that in engineering, there's trade-offs, there's pros and cons. And I think that this is no different. But again, I think that this just adds more tools to the arsenal for individuals to pick and choose. Now, let's, and it's really interesting, but we were talking about SSL and DNS, right? And just because that's what it is, the centralization of the current internet. And because of that centralization, right, it has inevitably been co-opted by government, right? Is that something that concerns you? Because that's the vast majority, of internet users, that's just how it works, right? We do know, for example, the hostility, not only from Europe, right, saying that they want to KYC certain software wallets. You had the digital assets framework released by the Biden administration. Clearly, there is hostility by governments, clearly, because this is a threat to their monopoly on the issuance of money and control of people by having that monopoly on money. Does that concern you? And where do you see this going? Is this, and I've heard this before, Matt, and perhaps you could elaborate on this. From what I heard, it's really an arms race, right? It's we must innovate faster than they can regulate. So what are your thoughts on all that? what do you see? Your business is based on all this, so I'm sure that these are a lot of the things that you've been that you think about a lot.
Mhm. We do. So ClearNet and our implementing it is part of a much larger and longer term strategy. We need adoption. Okay, we need people to adopt what is really radical technology. And oftentimes, to garner adoption of radical technology, you have to uh, make it somewhat compatible with and familiar to something that already exists. Otherwise, it's just too scary. Now, for hardline Bitcoiners and sort of our initial market and community and people who have supported us, that's not such a crazy thing. Like they're willing to go out on a limb and try something new. It's sort of what Bitcoin does to you. It sends you down this rabbit hole, and suddenly there's the memes of somebody going from like a corporate job with a tie on to just being like a hairy person in the woods, and that's what it does to you. And so, but that's not the most of the world right now. And we really, to win this, need eventually a lot of people switching over to the new technology. Otherwise, the old technology will just persist through inertia. And so, while we're not necessarily ready for mass adoption right now, we have to start taking measures to get ready for them. And part of that is this ClearNet story of enabling people to self host on the existing internet, as opposed to what we currently have, which is self hosting on either the local area network of your home, which is super lonely and allows you to interface with things, but doesn't allow others to, or two, over Tor, which is not only sort of inherently slow, but is also under attack and has been for many, many months. And so is very unstable and unreliable. So, what we need is something familiar that content creators, businesses, and other organizations can get on board with. What we need more than anything is organizations and content creators who opt for self hosting, but their audiences and employees and partners or whoever they're interacting with don't have to know it, right? Like they shouldn't realize that it's totally sovereign under the hood. These people, your followers and the congregation members, for example, should just feel like they're using a normal website, not realizing that this website is private and self hosted under the hood. And then gradually they can learn about this, and then they themselves can adopt this technology for their families. And then individual members of these families can adopt it for themselves as an individual. And so we see it as that's the progression is we go after the people who have reach and get them using the technology. But in order to do that, it needs to be familiar to their audiences. And then we sort of spread to the edges from there. Um, so that is why we're doing ClearNet. We also recognize that there is no future of this networking strategy. We are out to destroy ClearNet wholesale over the next decade or so. It's going to take a while, but that destruction or replacement begins next year. So internally, I have been messaging to the team and will now begin messaging sort of externally that 2023 for Start9 is the year of design, and it is the year of networking. And when I say networking, I don't mean like shaking hands with people. I mean networking strategies. How can computers talk to each other in geographically dispersed places around the world without compromising on privacy, anonymity, without involving trust, but gaining the benefits of ClearNet speeds and familiarity. And it's a really tough problem to solve. The good news is that there are multiple people working on this problem. Okay, there's a whole category of technologies, products, and teams right now that are working on what ultimately amount to the same concept, which is called hole punching. This idea that you can perform NAT traversal, that you can get a computer that is behind a NAT, basically behind a private network, and another computer that is either public, like a public IP, or is itself also behind a NAT, how do you get these two things to not only discover each other in a decentralized, trustless way, but then actually communicate with each other in an anonymous and private way? Um, and there's a few different strategies. Off the top of my head, forgive me, people I've talked to, if I leave you out of this. There's a few that come to mind. So there is SyncThing, which is an existing application that enables syncing across multiple devices. There is IPFS, uses a similar hole punching strategy. You have things like in the Bitcoin space, you have like Synonym.2, you have Impervious AI, you have Keat, which is a peer-to-peer video conferencing app that is built on Hole Punch. Hole Punch is a closed source piece of software at the moment, so it's not recommended, at least until they open it up, but is itself built on something called Hypercore. And Hypercore is this way of basically arriving at agreed upon state of a system without having to maintain an entire history like a blockchain. So Hypercore, in theory, kind of obsoletes or kind of nullifies many of the purported use cases of a lot of these altcoins or networks that are like trying to do super fast blocks and stuff like that. And we all know it's not going to go anywhere. But the idea of arriving at state without having this sort of Byzantine, fault tolerant consensus system underneath it, meaning it won't resist a wholesale, large scale nation state attack. But for most use cases on most days, it's going to be perfectly adequate for you on a private network. So I know that that was probably a lot of gibberish. Ultimately, what this amounts to is this. Throughout the year of 2023, the number of different ways that you will be able to access and use both your embassy and all of the services running on your embassy, and the ability of other people to access and use those services if you so choose, meaning you want people to shop at your store, the number of ways that that will be possible are going to proliferate. We are then going to take all of these different networking strategies like Tor, local area network, ClearNet, any form of hole punching, which always involves some third-party server that stores, ephemeral IP and port information. All of these things are going to be buried. We're going to obfuscate them. We are not going to burden the user with understanding anything that I just said. Embassy OS will dynamically assess the situation, like who is trying to access what and in what environment and circumstance, and essentially select the optimal way of connecting to that thing, maximizing for speed, security, privacy, anonymity, in order to facilitate the connection without you necessarily even understanding how that connection happened. Obviously, if you want more granular control, you will be able to have it, as in you can go in and disable or enable different strategies based on your threat model and risk tolerance.
Of course. And I love this, Matt, and it's really fascinating, and it didn't sound like a bunch of gibberish to me. I think what you're doing is really fighting for, because we kind of have to take a step back for people that understand how the internet works today, right? The internet works today if I want to message Matt, let's just, the most simple example, really, right? Even if I use Signal, that is great. Even if I use Proton Mail, which is great, they believe in encryption. They don't want to access your messages. Unfortunately, I can't just send a message directly to Matt. It has to go from me to a Signal server to a Proton server, and then it goes to Matt, right? And what I believe what you guys are fundamentally doing, and I think that the Bitcoin node, and I love Bitcoin for this reason, is the Trojan horse in all this, right? It's the reason as to why someone would run a dedicated computing device, server, whatever you want to call it. That's what I believe is the end goal here. Now, Matt, the thing that worries me and something that I've learned over the last 5-6 years as a Bitcoin educator is unfortunately human nature, right? And unfortunately, a lot of people, Benjamin Franklin has that famous quote, right? The people that would trade, liberty for security deserve neither. And what I've learned, right, unfortunately, specifically in developed countries, in a developing country, you don't have that luxury, right? But in developed countries, a lot of people tend to pick convenience, right? And that's just a sad reality. How do you propose making sovereign computing as convenient for individuals as the centralized co-opted systems that we have today?
Great point, and then great question. I want to comment on the point, and then I'll answer the question. So the first point being about Signal, Proton Mail, basically these privacy preserving hosted centralized services. It is far worse than your characterization of it. And here's why. Not only is a signal, and that's not a pun, right? Not the electrical signal to use Signal, the messaging app, going from your device to a Signal server to your counterparty's device. So you're having a chat with me and it's going like this. Signal's sitting right in the middle. Presumably, that is end-to-end encrypted such that Signal itself cannot read the messages. But as you stated, they can definitely do like network graph analytics. They know who you're talking to, they know when you're talking to them, and oftentimes that alone is undesirable or can even be incriminating in certain circumstances and in certain jurisdictions. It's worse than that because Signal, and I was trying to search for like a nuanced way to say this the other day, and at some point I'll put a tweet out, a little thread that kind of explains this, but maybe explaining it here will actually help me compose this. When a piece of centralized hosted software advertises itself as open source, that can actually be a negative thing. Okay. And here's why. Because it gives you a very false sense of security. A lot of people, when they hear Signal is open source, they just go from A to Z and sort of assume that the app they're using on their phone and the servers with which they're communicating through, or through which they're communicating, are actually running that code. You have no idea what code is running on your phone or on their servers. Signal could absolutely write a bunch of open source code, publish it, and then run some other fucking code on their server, and you have no way of validating this. So in fact, if your Signal, and if Signal is captured, and I'm not saying that they are, it's actually just a giant net for everyone who wants to be private. Okay. And there's a maxim in, we'll call it surveillance, in the surveillance industry, that pretty much guides the entire strategy for dragnet surveillance, which is good guys don't hide, bad guys do hide. That is the overarching maxim. So what you can do with this knowledge, right? And it's wrong, of course, right? Good guys hide because they value their privacy, but that's not the maxim that they're seeking. What they're saying is anyone who openly seeks privacy preserving, anonymous, encrypted technology is presumably or potentially a bad guy. So we're going to look much closer at them. So with that maxim in mind, pretty much every centralized hosted service that advertises itself as the private thing or the anonymous thing is potentially a giant fucking net, and you're walking right into it. You're better off just using Facebook. Okay. You're better off just like using open things because that's not where they're looking. They assume that anyone who's using those things is totally benign and a good guy because they're not trying to hide. So it's this really nasty situation where it's almost impossible to be private. You either have to communicate on things that are not private inherently, or you have to communicate on things that you think are private, but could be anything at all. We are the middle, we're the way to get through that, which is self-hosting, right? The only way that you can know that the privacy code and technology that you are using is actually preserving your privacy and anonymity is to host it yourself. That's the only way. And unfortunately, that is just really hard to do, or at least it has been traditionally, which is why we exist. That's our reason for existence, is to make self-hosting Easy. Okay. So that's just an elaboration on your first comment. It's much worse than many people think. Okay. Number two, I don't remember what you asked. What did you
It's
ask?
convenience. It's convenience, right? Which, by the way, great explanation, and that absolutely blew my mind because at the end of the day, yeah, I'm pulling up my Proton Mail app and it says end to end encrypted, but again, you're taking their word for it, and that's a really good point. I never thought about that. So, Matt, the original question was, let's talk about human nature and convenience, right? The sad reality is the vast majority of people are always going to pick convenience just because it's just human nature. It is what it is. I've learned this being a Bitcoin educator for years now. Yeah, let me just not take self-custody. I have to wait for FTX to blow up. A rug pull needs to happen for me to be like, okay, not your keys, not your Bitcoin. So, and it applies the same thing to sovereign computing, right? Unless, and this is I believe this is just the reality, unless you make it as convenient, right, for someone, or close to as convenient for someone to have their own dedicated, Bitcoin node, which you guys are already doing, which eventually becomes their own dedicated server of which they can have communications and all of that other stuff. How do you incentivize individuals to do that? Because, if enough people don't do this, then isn't going to be very easy for governments, intelligence agencies, the three-letter agencies to kind of single out, who is doing what, right? Isn't it kind of, the Bitcoin model, Bietis Numitis, power in numbers, is that required for this? And what do you think your solution would be to the convenience factor? I'm going to add to this a little bit, and then I want to get your thoughts, Matt. Everyone has a router at their home. Everyone kind of already has a dedicated device that's constantly plugged into the internet. And that seems like a great excuse to get a Bitcoin node in there, or a dedicated sovereign server in there. So what are your thoughts on this problem? I know you've thought about this, so let me know.
Okay. I'll answer the first one first. Let's talk about convenience as the battleground. You're right. That is exactly where this battle is taking place. In any purchase that a consumer makes, or an individual, in any value transaction, there's a cost benefit analysis that everyone is making, whether it is super subconscious and implicit, or whether they're explicitly, researching all the pros and cons of any given purchase. And traditionally, the cost benefit analysis that people have done and are continuing to do in many cases when it comes to SaaS, software as a service, cloud computing, if you want to think of it that way, apps on your phone that plug into third-party servers, which they all do. The cost benefit analysis that people have done on that has been pretty lopsided. They have said, this thing is free, freaking cheap, if not totally free, and it's got loads of benefits. It allows me to do such and such on my computer, and the costs are super low, again, if not free. There's something in the back of their mind that tickles them that says, where is the real cost, right? And more, they're starting to figure out what that real cost is. This phrase that if you're not paying for the product, you are the product. I'm very happy that is becoming popularized. I still don't think people fully understand what that means. But at least it's starting to enter the general public consciousness, is that when you are the product, the cost is basically everything about you. The goal of any cloud computing or SaaS company is to profile you as best as they possibly can. And I don't even mean this in like a your Bob type of profile. You're just number XYZ, right? It's not super personal. It's just that their goal is to understand everything about you, not only so that they can improve the products that you are using of theirs, but also so that they can sell that data to advertisers or other interested parties, right? Maybe government. And so they're essentially monetizing your data and your identity, everything about you. And more people are starting to recognize this hidden cost, this sort of indirect cost of these products, and they're starting to reject them. And this is expressing itself, ironically, through regulation and laws, right? You actually have policy now coming into play that requires SaaS providers, cloud providers, app developers to minimize what they collect about you, and to make it and to be transparent about what they're collecting about you, and to afford you ways of opting out of that collection, which means that more and more these companies are not going to be able to monetize you as an individual. They're not going to be able to productize you to the same extent that they used to be able to, which means that they're actually going to, interestingly, be pivoting to more of a normal business model, which is to charge you money. I've said this a few times before, and you can continue to mark my words that over the coming years and decade, pretty much every piece of software that you use will be paid for on a subscription recurring revenue basis. The free tiers of these things are going to get smaller and smaller and smaller, and the costs are going to get higher and higher and higher until you are basically getting nickel and dimed out of your ability to pay rent because of all the streaming services and apps that you are using on your phone. And as that happens, more and more people are going to, the cost benefit analysis is going to begin shifting because the cost is no longer hidden. The cost is direct and apparent. And so they're going to start looking at these apps and going, well, it does these things for me, but it also costs $20 a month. And so I'm going to not use it, or I'm going to look for an alternative. Secondly, and to the other side of your question, which is the convenience portion, the perception of benefit, okay? The perception of benefit of, say, some centralized, powerful tech company that made an app is really, really high. They assume that it's going to work awesome. They assume that, since it's so big and everyone uses it, that it's good. Like, the perception of benefit is very, very high. And when they think about like indie open source, kind of off the grid, do it yourself software, there's a perception that it is lacking. It is harder to use. It is harder to set up. And to be fair, these perceptions are largely accurate, or at least have been for the last couple of decades, because these centralized companies are very wealthy and have been able to garner these massive valuations and sell stock for over 40x revenue type of stuff. They've been able to hire giant teams of developers to create wonderful products. From my perspective, what they don't realize is that they've been doing the R&D for us. That's our R&D department, Google and Apple. They're doing all the research. They're iterating all of the services to teach us, the open source community, how to do it right. And the tide is turning. The open source software services and applications are learning from their again, R&D department predecessors and making better and better software. And so the perceived benefit of these two things are going to gradually get closer and closer and closer. So what you have is two complementary trends as we perceive it. And we do our outlook for the coming decade. You have centralized software as a service cloud applications are going to have this rising cost, and more importantly, perception of cost. Like, not only are people going to be paying with their data and privacy, but they're also going to be paying with their wallet. So the cost is rising. The perceived benefit is at best going to stay flat, maybe go up a little bit. But on the other side of the equation, when it comes to self-hosted open source software, the perceived cost is going to go down and down and down as we and others make it dramatically easier to use and build better and better user interfaces and user experiences around the software. The perceived cost of getting up and running is going to go down. It is inherently free for life, right? It is inherently free in open source software, so you don't pay for it. At most, you're paying an upfront capital cost for the computer itself, right? You need hardware. You got to run it on something, but that's a one-time fee. Maybe you get a new device every 5 to 10 years, but those savings are immediately apparent. Like that capital expense will pay itself off in a matter of months, according to how we view rising costs. So our primary focus on a daily basis is to make the convenience better and better and better, right? We call it convenience parity. If software as a service is up here, we're down here, and we're going to go like this. We're just going to get closer and closer and closer to the convenience that people are used to. I don't think we can ever reach it. I think that it's an asymptotic approach. We will never be as convenient as the centralized third-party model, because that third-party centralized model is inherently built on the concept of we'll do it for you. You don't have to do anything. We'll just do it for you. Whereas the core principle of our model is you'll do it yourself and you'll own it, right? You'll be free. You'll have total control. And while we can make the latter feel increasingly like the former, it's always going to be easier to have somebody do something for you than for you to do it yourself. But we think we can get close enough that the gap in convenience will be negligible to the massive discrepancy in cost, as in what we're doing is free and easy, and there's no privacy invasions, no chance of censorship. It's totally sovereign. You're free. That's like a huge benefit. Whereas theirs will be the surveilled, censored, high fees, monthly subscription. Like, we're going to blow them out of the water on the cost side, even if we can't quite get there on the convenience side.
And that's fascinating. And I really like how because it's true, right? And honestly, Matt, I would rather pay up front than be the product.
Wait,
you want
to own nothing and be happy?
Does Nico want to own nothing to be happy? Brother, I battle that stuff every single day. I want to be just as free as you. But dude, first of all, fascinating analysis and just breaking it down. So another interesting point, Matt, and I think that there's two utopias that people on different ideological bases, they look at the world, right? You have the collectivist utopia, and believe it or not, and I see this all the time in Bitcoiners, you have the libertarian utopia, right? And that's something that we all have to understand that it's very real. And one of the things, right, let's say in the ideal world, everyone's running their servers. Amazon web servers, like, man, it becomes a museum where you walk in there and it's like, this is how the internet used to work, right? But at the end of the day, right, and for anyone who doesn't know, the vast majority of the internet is connected by cables, undersea cables, right? And those can be potential vulnerable points of capture for governments. How does that fix that? How does the peer-to-peer internet, what we're all dreaming, what we hope to find ourselves in the future in, how do you guys actually mitigate the actual physical cables that the internet is connected by or connected with?
Yeah, you're talking about the long game here, the end game, right? The final boss of everything is surprisingly the physical world. When we first started Start9, I told my co-founders at the time that if we succeeded wildly, that if we really succeeded in bringing a new computing paradigm to this world and it grew, that over time, the only way that it would survive is if we vertically integrated all the way to the mining lithium, right? Like that we would eventually we would eventually get shut down. There's a choke point every single step of the way, right? Like, if we get so successful and we're really a threat, they'll shut the mine down. They'll withhold critical, rare earth metals from our or anybody else's ability to build chips that aren't backdoored. And so we don't need to worry about that right now, though, right? It's a today threat. It's a tomorrow threat. yes, we need to stay one step ahead. We need to be aware that these threats are coming, but you don't solve tomorrow's problems today. That's how you die. You have to
Yeah.
solve today's problems today. And quite frankly, to be very focused as a team. Otherwise, you get ahead of yourself. So the fiber optic cables are a few steps away. We're not worried about those right now because we can effectively hijack them, right?
Mm.
For antithetical purposes. I shouldn't say antithetical. They are designed to process information, and we will continue to use them for what they were designed for. But we can make that information encrypted, right? Encryption is the secret weapon here.
Yeah.
So long as encryption is real, which we have every reason to believe that it is, and there isn't some crazy project that's been going on where SHA-256 is actually broken and the government's just not telling us. I don't believe that.
I don't believe that either.
No, they don't have the capability. So as long as encryption is real, we can hijack significant portions of the existing physical and digital infrastructures of this planet for our own, to build our own parallel digital systems. And so long as using encryption and certain networking strategies, such as Tor, is not itself incriminating, then we will succeed, right? The danger here is if a government comes in and says something like, Tor is illegal, okay? Or if we detect that you are utilizing networking protocol A, say Nostr, for instance, which is of great interest to us at the moment, and there is certain network traffic analytics that you can perform, that the ISP could perform, they don't know what you're doing. They don't know what you're saying because, again, encryption works, right? But they can conclude that guy's using Tor, right? When you use an embassy in your home today, your ISP knows that you are using Tor. They don't know what you're using it for. They can't even see what website you're accessing, meaning it's your own website in your embassy. They don't know what that is. They can't interpret any of the information that's being passed over, but they can say you're using Tor. So the problem comes in is if a government just says using Tor is illegal, then we have a problem on our hands. Not a problem, not an insurmountable problem, but it is a definite attack vector. And so we don't think they're going to do it. We don't think that governments or big tech corporations who have an interest in protecting their monopolies, et cetera, we do not believe that they will opt for the nuclear option. And in this case, the nuclear option is wholesale banning the movement of information that is either encrypted or being processed on a given network. Because if they did that, it would require such a blatant violation of human rights, the United States Constitution, and basically every Western democracy there is, that they just won't get away with it. We hope, right? As we've seen, the population has a tendency to kind of go along with things. And I've been largely disappointed over the last years to see some of this. But there are lines. And I ultimately do have confidence, at least in the American ethos and history and tradition of individual rights and freedom, that there are lines and people are willing to stand on them and protect them. And so I don't think things like encryption could ever be banned. I think that politicians could posture. I think they could even try to pass bills that make certain kinds of things illegal or legal, but ultimately they're not competent enough. They don't have the numbers. They're going to lose that battle. So I think that we can hijack, utilize, usurp much, if not all, of the existing physical and digital infrastructure that they have spent building in order to monitor, surveil, and control everyone for exactly the opposite.
Beautiful. And you're the part that was fascinating to me, Matt, and this part of the encryption wars, and I think that we are heading towards encryption war 2.0, right? In the 90s was, certain types of encryption was illegal. Then people wore t-shirts with that exact thing. And then, they couldn't win that. And then it's a First Amendment issue, right? And I think we're heading into the second where, for the first time in American history, the U.S. Treasury, specifically the Office of Foreign Asset Control, sanctioned open source software. And the reason that I believe they did that is to attempt to set a precedent, because Bitcoin, whether you like it or not, is a threat to current US sanction policy, which gives the tremendous amount of power to the US government, because they've been weaponizing the dollar to get what they want, or to believe they're getting what they want, because you can't make a good faith argument that sanctions are effective either. So yeah, I definitely think that we're heading into the so-called crypto wars 2.0, and I think that can be a point of contention. But what's fascinating to me, Matt, is holy crap, did the founding fathers of the United States 200 something years ago, just because of how much they hated tyranny, did they nail that? And they made it the first one. And it might become one of our most powerful tools in the battle of separation of money and state. How do you believe we're going in this adoption race? On Simply Bitcoin, we're in the media front. So we fundamentally believe here is a war for hearts and minds. We need to get as many people as possible taking Bitcoin into self-custody, taking that orange pill. If enough people do that, we win, right? But it is an arms race. How do you believe you're doing on your side? And I want to preface that question with, I was also extremely disappointed how effective their propaganda machine was at capturing the hearts and minds of so many individuals and basically leading them like sheeps to a slaughter. Unfortunately, I couldn't believe it. So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, you definitely nailed the sort of other side of the coin about what I was saying earlier, which is that, what we don't do, except for appearances like this, obviously, is the awareness and education aspect of what's going on, right? So perception of cost, perception of benefit is all, very largely affected, not just by the products and technologies that are being used, but by people's understanding of them. And so that is why I go out of my way to support and try to, do anything that we can to help you and others in your battle to educate and raise awareness towards not only the nature of the problem, but of the nature and existence of viable, albeit nascent, but viable growing solutions to these problems. So, I commend you, I support you, and it's just not what we do. We're technologists and product people, and that's our battle. But the other,
But it's the same. It's the same war, my friend.
I know,
You might be on one front, and we're in the trenches on the other front, but it's still
I
the
know.
same fight.
Exactly, right. But specialization, it matters, right? We have to focus on our core competency and what we're best at, and you're going to focus on your core competency and what you're best at. And we join the show together right now to
Yeah.
strategize and divide and conquer. So okay, so with that in mind, the core of your question there was, are people going to do it?
How do you see? So I'm seeing it from, again, the media
Yeah,
perspective. So for example, the FTX blow up was amazing, because I'm sorry for anyone who got involved. You should have taken Bitcoin, not your keys, not your Bitcoin, right? We've been screaming that from the rooftop from literally 3 years now. But that's led people to take Bitcoin off exchange. Do you see the same adoption rate with individuals realizing, if I'm not using my own node, I'm basically trusting someone else's node? Do you see that popularity rising?
yeah. So the very existence of Start9 and other node and personal server projects in the greater Bitcoin and sovereign computing space is a degree of evidence that there is demand for this. These organizations, companies are not doing this because nobody cares, and we're not doing it in light of the fact that interest is waning. It's not. People do care. Interest is growing, and our community, the people who discover us and take the time to actually look, it's like Bitcoin. You have to actually look. It takes a little bit of effort, and we're trying to minimize the amount of effort. But people who have discovered us and actually looked become, what's the right word? Obsessive. They're passionate. Okay, we don't have customers, we have partners, we have members of the movement, and that isn't something that we like go out and try to rah with marketing. It's just the nature of what we're doing. What we're doing is inherently radical, powerful, freedom breathing, sovereign technology, and we mean it. And we're not cutting corners. We're doing it right, even if doing it right ultimately results in our failure as a business. As long as we are capable, as long as we survive long enough and are successful enough to shepherd this technology to its mature state where it can function as a viable off-ramp and means of opting out of the centralized surveillance state and of the extortionary practices of big tech, then we will have succeeded in my mind. I don't want to die. I would like to succeed wildly. I'd like to make a bunch of money for myself and my family and our future, but that isn't the primary objective. The primary objective is to usher the technology to maturity. And so how do we think it's going? I think we're doing great. I think that we are doing a good job. I think others are doing a good job. I definitely think that we are leading the charge in this push towards generalized sovereign technology, of which Bitcoin is sort of the bleeding heart and centerpiece and spear tip of the entire movement. But it is broader than Bitcoin. It is about all of information technology. It's about decentralizing Earth's information grids and bringing power back to the edges of the network as opposed to the hubs of the network. And we are, quite frankly, very excited on a daily basis, as is our community, but we absolutely don't take it for granted. I personally do not believe in historical determinism. I believe that it is perfectly possible that we and others and Bitcoin will fail and usher in perhaps one of the darkest, most prolonged ages of tyranny and oppression that the world has ever seen. I also think it's perfectly possible that we will trounce them and beat them down like the little children that they are and win this thing in a matter of 10 years. I think those are the two opposing extremes. I think in reality, this is probably a 2 to 3 generation battle, simply for the fact that anybody over the age of X, I'm not going to offend anyone, but the older the generation is, the more unlikely they are to totally learn something brand new and pivot their entire worldview and adopt brand new technology. It's just not feasible. That ultimately, to win a war of any historic consequence, you need children, and you need their children, and you need their children. You need 2 new generations of children to completely change the culture of a society. Lenin actually was one of the more famous people to have said, I believe, don't quote me on the exact wording here, but something like, you give me 2 generations of children and I will give you a nation of communists. And we can say something similar, which is, you give us 2 generations of children and we'll give you a world of sovereign individuals. And so it's a long game. A lot of Bitcoiners are, I think, overly optimistic about, how quickly we might reach providence. I think it's going to take a few generations, and I hope to be alive when we get there. But educating children on both the nature of the problem and on the growingly powerful solutions is the key to winning.
Absolutely. And, it's crazy because obviously working in the same industry, but we're working in different sectors of this industry. And the militantness and the urgency is the same. I say this every single day, or almost every day. I say, good morning, Bitcoin or slavery. And a lot of people are like, you're being hyperbolic. No, I'm not. Right? They're telling you exactly what they want to do with central bank digital currencies. And Jack Mahler said it best. And you said it perfectly. We're willing to we're willing to die on this hill because we understand what's at stake. And I completely agree with you. The last question, Matt, we see this all the time, right? Whether it's Simply Bitcoin, whether it's Start9, whether, you know, the other militant Bitcoiners, you know, Bull Bitcoin, Francis, right? We all have this. There you go. We all have this. We all have this. I guess we all kind of reach the same conclusion, and we're all looking at it from a perspective of, look, if we don't win this, they're gonna win, and the life that they want for us is just so atrocious. Why is it that we all come to this? Why does Bitcoin do this to people on a psychological level? Is it the freedom? Is it the freedom that they've never tasted before? And all of a sudden, when they have the ability to save and earn in money that a nation state, a country, a dictator, an emperor can't censor or debase, is that what just snaps in people's minds, and then they appreciate this newfound freedom? What do you think that is? Because the reason I'm asking this question is because you said all of that, and it's fascinating to me. I know Opti's listening to in the background, and we are literally, we think the same exact way. We're just fighting on a different front. Why do you think Bitcoin does that to people?
Bitcoin proved that it was possible. I know that personally in my mid-20s, I guess I'll date myself. It was about 12 years ago. I was fairly depressed, not for personal reasons. I've always been keenly interested in history and politics and economics, and I didn't see a way. I didn't understand how you could defeat such a horrible beast that has become the, for lack of a better term, just our society, our world. And I didn't really see a way out. The darkest point was Ron Paul, 2012, where I saw hope in a candidate who seemed to understand the game, was absolutely correct about everything, and had a passionate base of young, intellectual people. And I was like, that is the makings of a revolution. That is what we need. And watching him, quite frankly, get flicked off the table like he was a fly pestering this monster really hit me deep. I realized how powerful of a foe we were up against, that somebody as correct and someone with that much momentum and support could just be discarded. I got depressed, and shortly thereafter read a couple of different things and found Bitcoin. Those things were, for as big of a douchebag as the guy is, Anti-Fragile, Nassim Taleb, Sovereign Individual. I read Mastering Bitcoin, and ultimately just went down the Bitcoin rabbit hole, also a heavy dose of Ayn Rand, and arrived at the conclusion that there actually was a way, that there was a weak point in the armor of the enemy, and furthermore, and more importantly, that the enemy only derives its power from us, that it is itself impotent and incapable of doing anything without the support, consent, and productive energy of the people it wants to dominate. And so I was like, wow, we're actually fighting against an impotent blob, that all you have to do is recognize its nature and opt out, essentially strike, opt out, don't feed it, and it'll just die like the slug it is. And that Bitcoin was the ultimate means of opting out, because the central power of this monster comes from its ability to create and control money. And that when you create Bitcoin, I didn't view Bitcoin as a weapon. I viewed Bitcoin as an exit ramp, a way to get out of the financial and monetary system and therefore starve the beast. right? It can't survive without our economic contribution. Then, with sovereign individual plus my own acumen as a developer plus surrounding myself with like-minded people, discovered a way that I could also get into this fight and give people a way of opting out of the information grid. So not only can you opt out of money, but you can opt out of data. You can take back your data from the grid. And I realized that the monster was surviving as much on its ability to create and control money as it was on its ability to surveil and control information.
Mm-hmm. Bingo. Bingo. Is Bitcoin John Galt?
Satoshi, maybe. Yeah, I mean, it's definitely Bitcoin. Yeah, I mean,
If
what
you
did John
know,
Galt do, right? John Galt convinced the most productive, intelligent, leaders and people who move the world to opt out, to stop giving their productive energy to their destroyers. And I think that's what Bitcoin is doing. It is discovering or allowing itself to be discovered by the best of us. And slowly but surely, we are removing ourselves from that system. Start9, for example, has a goal of being on a complete Bitcoin standard by the end of 2023. We will not participate in the fiat financial system. If somebody wants to buy a device from us and they have dollars, they will have to figure out a way to convert those dollars to Bitcoin just in time to pay us in Bitcoin. If someone wants to be paid by us and they want dollars, they will have to figure out a way to convert the Bitcoin that we're going to pay them with into dollars. And we are doing this appropriately and strategically. We're not just going to do it overnight because it would basically mean the destruction of our business. But gradually, we will move away from the dollar and all other fiat standards and currencies.
Beautiful. Man, I enjoyed that conversation. Bitcoin insulates capitalism and individuals from, I don't want to use Opti's words, but what is it? I call them the monetary demons. Opti calls them the high level parasites.
Yeah.
And it protects individuals, the likes of which has never been seen before. Matt Hill, that was quite a ride. I really enjoyed that. Why don't you tell everybody where they could find you and, of course, what you're working on?
I am on Twitter at _ Matt Hill _ Start9 is start9.com. Follow those two tracks and you'll get a good picture of what we do and who we are and why we're doing it, and what products we have available. And we have a Telegram chat, which I don't know off the top of my head. I think it's t.me.start9 _ labs. Don't quote me on that, where that's the sort of community hub. Unfortunately, out of all three of those things that I just said, two of them are hosted centralized services. We're working on it. We're working on it.
It's soon to change, and I'm sure that you guys will figure it out. Anyways, guys, that was another episode of Simply Bitcoin IRL. Matt, I'm going to put you backstage for a second. We will see you tomorrow back at the live show, 12:15 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Love you all. We'll catch you tomorrow. See you later.